Um, Welcome everyone to the second presentation of the Ballarat Marathon seminar series. During this series, we will cover tapering and race day strategies, which was presented last week by Julian Spence, common running injuries, the Norwegian training model, and optimizing nutrition for marathon performance, which is the focus of tonight's presentation. Michelle Ryan, tonight's presenter, boasts over a decade of experience as a registered dietitian with both Dietitians Australia and Sports Dietitians Australia. Michelle has worked with a range of clients from beginners to elite athletes and regularly offers advice to enhance athletic performance through her work at RAD Centre. In tonight's session, Michelle will dive into strategies for distance running, including carbohydrate loading and race day nutrition. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Before we start, though, just some housekeeping rules. Your mics will be on mute by default. And a notice to all of you that this will be recorded. So we'll do our best to make sure that you maintain some anonymity with post editing, but so you are all aware this will be recorded, and a link will be made to anyone who has registered. There is also a Q&A section that we will be moderating. So if you have any questions along the way, please pop them in there, and then Michelle will be able to answer those questions at the end of her presentation. That's enough from me. I'm going to hand over. Thank you very much for coming in tonight, Michelle.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for everyone who's logged in and jumped in online. Just as a little bit of a, I guess, preface for tonight, it is weird for me to present and not be able to take questions as we're going. So please drop those into the Q&A and we will, definitely address those towards the end. As Ryan mentioned, tonight I'm going to be covering the importance of fueling well, particularly for the marathon, but for endurance running in general. Looking at pre and post training nutrition, as well as fueling for your marathon, with some hydration stuff thrown in the mix. So hopefully I can answer most of your questions that you've got specifically for the Ballarat Marathon, but as I said, any endurance running that you're doing at all over the next little while. Before I launch into kind of the details, I did want to flag underfueling, and this is something that I see a lot of in our endurance athletes, and it's something that is often kind of the effects of are underestimated. So I wanted to highlight what some of the signs of underfueling might be, and also some of the, I guess, short and long-term impacts that underfueling can have on you from a health perspective, but also from a performance perspective. So I apologise because this infographic is a little bit blurry, but I will run through briefly what each of those points says so that you can see. But in the middle there we can see REDS, which is what we call relative energy deficiency syndrome, or in sport, depending on which terminology you use. And it's, I guess, the syndrome that we sort of identify in athletes when they're not fueling their bodies enough for the amount of physical activity they're doing. So for underfueling, some of the signs that you might pick up are really obvious. So things like fatigue or just not recovering well from your runs. But it might be a little bit more subtle. So it might be things like gastrointestinal distress, psychological impact. So things like being grumpy, a bit more irritable than usual, anxious when that's not your normal temperament. For our younger athletes, underfueling can impact our growth and development, can also impact our immune function. So just that susceptibility to colds and flus and things like that, particularly coming into winter. But if we're sort of training at really high intensity and we're not eating enough, that can really, sort of dampen our immune system and make us a bit more susceptible. Can also have impacts on our cardiovascular system. So if we're not putting enough fuel in the tank to support our running, we're not going to be nourishing our general well-being. So things like our heart muscle and the muscles that line our blood vessels can be sort of weakened, and that can present as dizziness, fainting, and also really slow heart rate, which one is a sign of fitness, but also can be a sign that our body's just not coping with the amount of work we're doing. So we really want to make sure that we are fueling our bodies well so that we're functioning, our heart's working well to keep us upright, but also performing. Some of you may be familiar with the terminology female athlete triad, which we used to obviously identify in female, particularly endurance athletes, which was the absence of menstrual function. So if we're not eating enough, menstrual function and the hormones associated with that tend to drop off, which can have an impact on fertility, but also bone health. So susceptibility to bone stress injury and low bone mineral density. So we tend not to use the female athlete triad kind of terminology anymore because we know there are there's much more to it. And we also see these symptoms, obviously not the menstrual dysfunction, but we see these symptoms and I guess profiles in our male athletes as well. So it's not a gender specific thing. It happens across the board. So just signs and symptoms to look out for. Obviously, nutrient deficiencies is another one. So if you're having bloods done with your GP and your iron levels are low, other nutrients are low, again, can be a sign that we're not fueling enough. So they're the important reasons why we want to be making sure we're ticking all the boxes. And tonight we're going to cover how to do that. Excuse me, a couple of terms that I'm going to talk a little bit about tonight, and I know they can be a bit jargony, so depending on your experience with running and nutrition, you may not know these terms, so I'll just run through them really quickly. Often we will talk about glycogen stores. So that is our body's way of storing carbohydrate, which is our body's favourite preferred fuel source for running, particularly endurance running. We store glycogen in our liver and in our muscles, so it's ready to go. We also have a small amount of glucose or carbohydrate or fuel floating around in our bloodstream. In everyday life and also in endurance running particularly, we are also utilising fat as a fuel source. So we store body in our we store energy in our fat tissue in our bodies and utilise that particularly during aerobic activity, endurance running. However, fats, I guess, take a lot more to burn, and therefore we're not going to be running as fast as if we're utilising glucose. So we want to be prioritising glucose and carbohydrates. We're in a pretty bad way if our body is starting to break down protein. So knowing that we use fats and protein, but absolutely our primary source of fuel during a marathon is going to be carbohydrate, coming from what we've stored up in our liver and our muscle, also what's in our blood, and also what we put in the tank during our events. So in terms of pre-run nutrition, so this is kind of looking at what we're doing before a training session, but also on race day. So pre-run, we want to be looking at topping up our carbohydrate stores in our bodies. We want something that's nice and easy to digest so that it's not sitting heavy in our gut. And this will look different for everybody. So some runners are able to tolerate absolutely anything. We sort of say they've got a bit of a cast iron gut. They'll happily sit, with a really high fat meal and not have any issues with that. Others really don't tolerate much at all. So it's about individualizing what works well for you in terms of pre-run nutrition. And having something that's, nice and familiar to you. So typical examples that we'd see for pre-run nutrition are things like some toast with honey or jam on it. Again, really easy to digest, simple carbohydrates, simple cereals, so things like rice bubbles, cornflakes. Lots of runners will do porridge or oats, particularly in the winter. Things like pikelets, pancakes, crumpets. It's just been hot cross bun season, so things like hot cross buns, raisin toast are all really good options. Fruit is another one, but there are no, I guess, reasons or rules around having things that aren't your typical kind of breakfast foods if you're running in the morning. So things like rice or pasta are absolutely okay to have pre-run. But ideally, something to top up our fuel stores, something in the tank, because we're going to be out there, particularly towards the end and towards race day, we're going to be out there running for a decent amount of time and doing a fair amount of Ks. So we want some food to top you up and get you through those. In terms of timing, and this again is really variable athlete to athlete, But in an ideal scenario, the research shows that we want something, a decent sized meal, about between 2 and 4 hours before our run. 1 to 2 hours before we run, we top up with a bit of a snack, so a smaller snack or meal. I'll talk about kind of the sizing of these in a sec. And then about 15 minutes before we head out, we want to be topping up with something quite little to, again, just fill us up. So if we're talking race day and we're looking at an 8 a.m. start, I'm not expecting people to be getting up at 4 a.m. Some of you will be, some of the elites will be, absolutely, getting up at 4 a.m. to have a solid brekkie to get that done and tick that box. But for the majority of us, we're probably looking at about 1 to 2 hours out, having a decent brekkie, and then topping up on the start line. So again, what that might look like for you is just a smaller version. So you might have a big, couple of pieces of toast and some cereal, a coffee, a bagel and a coffee, something like that, 4 hours before. Jam sandwich about an hour out, and then after you've done your warm-up, just on the start line, topping up with a gel or a banana, something along those lines. So a rough breakdown, and the reason we kind of pick those, we give those rough timelines, is 4 hours gives us plenty of time to digest our food, get it through our digestive system, and maximise our gut comfort. It also gives us a chance to get that carbohydrate into our muscles and into our liver as glycogen stores, and be able to have a little bit in our bloodstream heading around so that we can, kick off on the start line. Main thing with pre-run nutrition is you want to be practicing. So practicing now, ideally we would have been practicing prior to now, but absolutely practicing when you're doing your long runs, what you're going to do on race day, and trying to replicate that as best you can. It won't be perfect. It won't be exactly what you do on race day necessarily, but if you can mimic as much as possible what you plan to do on race day, practice it, see how your body feels, and be able to work out what you tolerate and what you don't tolerate well. As I said, some athletes will tolerate heaps of food, others won't. Some love dairy, others can't handle that dairy pre-race. So play around with it and find what works best for you. And particularly on race day, making sure that you're using something that is really familiar to you and that you've practiced time and time again. In terms of recovery, so from a training perspective, recovery, we add some protein in. So essentially we're trying to top up our carbohydrate stores, so anything that we've used up while we've been out on a run, but we also want to add some protein to recover our muscles, repair any damage that we might have done, so any little niggly injuries. Just day-to-day running does tiny amounts of damage to our muscles, and we put some protein back in, and that helps enhance our performance and get us back on track for our next run. So protein foods are dairy, meat and alternatives. So our alternatives are things like tofu, legumes, eggs, nuts and seeds. So getting some protein food in post-training, with some carbs, and ideally also with some fluid. So every sports dietitian's favourite recovery food is a good old chalky milk. So thinking about the practicalities of that around your training, is it just that you head straight home from your run and you have brekkie in the morning, or you have second brekkie in the morning after your run? If you're running in the evening, is it you're just going home and you're having dinner? If there's going to be a long time in between a run and your next normal meal, having a little quick, easy snack in between can be really helpful. Again, when you're running lots of Ks during the week, every little bit that we can add in and top up and help to re-nourish our bodies can be really helpful. So things like an up and go or a chalky milk or a squeezy yogurt, some fruit and yogurt, something along those lines, just to help enhance that recovery process before you get your next balanced meal in. As I said before, this is really weird to present and not actually have any feedback, because I'm sure there's lots more that I can expand on all of these things. But we'll jump into carb loading. So there's been lots of changes and lots of back and forward with the information around carb loading over the years. And generally speaking, if we are eating regularly throughout the week, we're eating regular meals and snacks, so kind of 3 meals and 2 to 3 snacks throughout the day with a balance from all of our food groups, we're going to have a decent amount of glycogen stored in our body, and we're going to be relatively well fueled. There is still plenty of evidence out there to support carb loading, and the current protocol is generally for 2 to 3 days out from the race, definitely at least 1 day out from your race, doing a carb loading protocol. So what that looks like in terms of numbers, for those of you who love numbers, it's eating or aiming to eat around 7 to 10 grams of carbohydrate per kilo of your body weight per day, which is a decent amount of carbohydrate, and I'll talk to what that looks like food-wise in a second. In terms of comfort, we also aim for a lower fibre carbohydrate load. So that is just because it is such a phenomenal amount of food to get that volume of carbohydrate in, that if we're eating really high fibre foods, one, it's tricky to get the volume we need in, but two, it can lead to a little bit of gut distress. So it might be constipation, diarrhea, just a bit of bloating and feeling quite unwell. So we aim for lower fibre foods as much as possible with our carb loading protocol. So to give you an example, if we're looking at a 70 kilo athlete, which is a number I've just pulled out of the air because it's nice and easy to calculate, 70 kilo athlete, and we're aiming for 10 grams per kilo per day. So that's about 700 grams of carbohydrate in a day for this athlete. So this is on the top end of a carb loading protocol. It looks like about this much food. So brekkie, having a decent sized bowl of low fibre cereals, so something like rice bubbles, cornflakes, with milk, with a piece of fruit, a glass of juice, 2 pieces of jam or honey on toast. Morning tea being a milky coffee, and a cow's milk coffee at that, just so it's got the carbohydrates in it. A muesli bar or a cereal bar, and about a cup of jelly. Couple of sandwiches at lunch. Canva only let me have the ham and salad sandwich. It might actually be a lighter sandwich than that. If you're an athlete who doesn't tolerate huge amounts of food, you might just do a honey sandwich or a cheese and Vegemite sandwich, something that's not as dense as that and doesn't have as much salad in it. But again, it just depends on you and your tolerance. You might easily eat 2 ham and salad sandwiches and not have any trouble with that. Again, a glass of juice, about 12 jelly snakes, another piece of fruit. For afternoon tea, looking at 4 rice cakes with some honey, a decent serve of pasta, so a couple of cups of pasta, again, some more juice, some jelly, some yogurt and some fruit, and then some supper, so a couple of pieces of raisin toast for supper. So you do not have to follow that to the T, but that's an example of kind of how much food and what sort of foods we would be looking at in a carb loading protocol. Also, having a couple of carbohydrate containing drinks. So there'd be a couple of 2 600 ml sports drinks in that protocol as well. So that's from an electrolyte point of view and a hydration point of view, but also because it's just an easier way of getting some carbohydrates in. So we're not following the general healthy eating guidelines when we're carb loading. We're just trying to get those carbohydrates in. So again, for some athletes, that's a lot of food. For others, that's pretty easy to manage. The guidelines are the same, whether you're male or female. There has been some, conversations in the research around whether females benefit from carb loading as much as males do. And the current consensus is yes, they absolutely do. And the guidelines are still the same. So around that 7 to 10 grams per kilo per day in that 2 to 3 days before the race. I guess one of the reasons they thought carb loading didn't work for female athletes in the past was that some of our female athletes struggled to get that amount of food in. So if you can absolutely aim for those same numbers, you will get the same benefits whether you're male or female. Now the fun stuff. So fueling during a run, and particularly during a marathon, if we look at kind of the time spent running, which is the best way to work out whether you will benefit from consuming carbohydrates during that run or not. If you're out for less than 30 minutes, there's no real benefit from eating during your run. If you're running for 30 to 60 minutes, you may benefit from small amounts of carbohydrate and even a mouth rinse. So what we mean by that is just having like a swish of sports drink in your mouth and then spitting it out. So it doesn't even have to get to your gut. It doesn't really have to be absorbed. The theory there is that you kind of trick your brain to say, yep, there's some more fuel coming. It's okay, you can keep running and we get some benefit from it, but there's not a huge benefit to consuming much if we're running for less than 60 minutes. If we're running between 60 and 90 minutes, there is really good evidence that you will benefit from aiming to eat 30 to 60 grams of carb per hour that you're running. And if you're running for more than 90 minutes, again, there's solid evidence for anything between 30 grams per hour all the way up to 120 grams per hour. And those of you in the virtual room who have done a lot of running and a lot of attempting to eat while you run will realize that 120 grams per hour is a lot of carbohydrate. Most of the research in this space has been done with cyclists or athletes who are on a bike, whether it be a stationary bike or out on the road. But there is still solid evidence that runners will benefit from that amount of carbohydrate. However, it's tricky to get there. It's tricky to get that amount in, and most athletes kind of hit a point where they can't tolerate that much. So it's not worth pushing to that volume. So most athletes will sit somewhere between 30 and 60. Some will be able to push to 90, and there'll be a very select few who will be able to push to 120. But certainly for most of us, and particularly if this is your first marathon, aiming on the lower end is probably where we want to be. So around that 30 grams to 60 grams per hour. In terms of the physiology of how much our bodies can actually absorb at any one time, we can, if we're hitting more than 60 grams of carbohydrate an hour, we actually need to mix our carb types. And some of you will have heard in promotion of sports products or just in conversations with athletes or online, the term multiple transportable carbohydrates. Basically what that means is we just mix different types of carbohydrates or different types of sugars to optimize absorption. So if we're only using one type of sugar, so if we're only using glucose, we max out. Nobody can physically absorb any more than 60 grams per hour from their digestive system. It's just not possible. However, different types of carbohydrates, so glucose and fructose, are absorbed via different pathways. So if we're eating a product that has both glucose and fructose in it, we can push to those higher levels, so up to that 120 grams per hour. So we can sort of hack the system a little bit with that, which is pretty cool. And most products now are created with multiple transportable carbohydrates. So you'll typically see on the label of a gel or a sports drink, in the ingredients list, you'll see glucose and fructose, or I'm seeing more and more commonly maltodextrin and fructose. So maltodextrin is just a longer chain glucose, so just a different form of glucose. All do pretty similar things, but yeah, if we've got those combinations, we're going to get more out of that product. So when we're aiming to fuel a marathon, you need to ask yourself a few questions. What type of carbohydrate? So we know everybody's going to benefit from having some carbohydrate during their run. So you need to think about how you get that. Is it solid? Is it liquid? Or is it gel? They tend to be the ones we're looking at. So most athletes will go for a liquid or a gel because they're easier to digest. But some athletes prefer to chew something. So solids or semi-solids, like your confectionery type products. So your energy chews. So Scratch do some, Cliff do some as well, but there are plenty of others on the market. Even just your stock standard jelly lollies, so jelly snakes, frogs, whatever your weapon of choice is, you might go with those as well. So pick what kind of carbohydrates you want, or do you want a combination of both? And then working out how much we need. So how many gels do you need? How many mils of sports drink do you need? So are you aiming for 30 grams per hour? So having a look at your product, if you're aiming, so let's take 60 grams per hour as an example. A lot of athletes will be aiming for that. So have a look at your product. How many grams of carbohydrate does it have? So your nutrition information panel will tell you that. A lot of gels will have about 20 grams per serve. So if you're aiming for 60 grams per hour, you need 3 gels in the hour, and roughly spreading that out over the hour. So you're probably going to be aiming for a gel every 20 minutes if it's a 20 gram per serve gel. In terms of safety, a lot of these products are technically supplements, so we do need to be wary of what's in them, particularly if you're an athlete who's going to be subjected to substance testing. Most sports gels, sports drinks, and sports confectionery are what we consider AIS Group A supplements. They're usually pretty safe, usually don't have anything untoward in them, but always checking is part of your due diligence. Be mindful that some of your gels particularly are caffeinated, and it's not always easy to tell which ones are and which ones aren't. They will always say on the product whether they are caffeinated or not, but some of them it's just a flavour change or a colour change in the packs. So checking that and knowing whether your gels are caffeinated or not, just being mindful of that, because ideally, you don't want a surprise. You don't want a caffeinated gel if you haven't practiced with them and you're not familiar with how your body responds to those. So just be wary of that. That's one of the major differences to look out for. In terms of timing of taking your carbohydrate on board, start at the start. So like I said before, about 15 minutes before race start. So basically do your warm up, head to the start line and have a source of carbohydrate. It might be solid or it might be that you start with your gels, but start early so that you've got some in your system and then go from there. One of the things that a lot of athletes struggle with is gut tolerance with carbohydrates. Again, lots of recent research is showing us that we can actually train your gut to tolerate higher amounts of carbohydrate over time. So your gut is a series of muscles. We can train our muscles in our body. We can train our gut to tolerate carbohydrate and to absorb carbohydrate better without some of those adverse effects. So if you're practicing taking your gels or your preferred source of carbohydrate during your long runs, during your training runs, even if you don't necessarily need them in terms of you're not out there for as long, if you're practicing with them and you're getting your body used to them, you will be much better on race day. Typically on race day, we tend to be a little bit more fragile in terms of our tolerance. So if you've practiced time and time and time again, you're less likely to get surprises on race day. So practice during your long runs, practice before, practice around training, and try and avoid anything new on race day if you can. Sometimes it's completely unavoidable, but certainly you don't want too many surprises. You don't want to be running for Portaloos at any point in your event if you can avoid it. So in terms of practicalities, checking out what's available on course. So if you jump on the Ballarat Marathon website, there is some information about aid stations and what is available. So at this point, it looks like there will be aid stations about every 3 Ks on course, and there will be electrolyte or sports drink available. and also some gels. So knowing what's available, what products they are. So I can say that they are SIS gels with some goo gels as well. So knowing what's on course, have a think about how you are going to carry your nutrition if you're not relying on what's on the course. And I highly recommend that you carry as much as you can with you rather than relying on aid stations. Whether that be race belts, not necessarily recommending what this athlete here has done, but there are a whole lot of gels pinned to their shorts. But think about the practicalities. If you need, 8 gels throughout your marathon, how are you going to wear them? Do you have a race belt? Have you practiced running with your race belt? Have you practiced taking your gels out of your race belt, opening them while you're running? Those sorts of really practical things. If you are thinking about popping a gel in your shorts or in your bra, how does that sit? Is that going to rub or chafe? Really thinking about the practicalities and practicing as much as you can with those. And yeah, like I said, try and carry as much as you can for yourself and prepare in advance. So for those of you who may not have run a marathon before or may not have run in an event like this before, aid stations can get pretty chaotic. They can get slippery. They can get, they can run out of products. You may miss an opportunity at an aid station. So if you've got what you need on you and on your body, you're going to be much better for it. I would hate for anyone to be relying on getting 100% of their nutrition on course and suddenly on race day we run out of gels, or there's a different gel and that's not what we said we were going to have, or it's not what you're used to. So yeah, take what you can if possible, as much as possible. And yeah, like I said, have a practice. Think about how you're going to tackle those aid stations. Are you going to walk through? Are you going to run through? If you're going to run through, have you practiced drinking out of a cup while you're running? Those sorts of things. In terms of your hydration, so if we look at everyday hydration, the best way to tell whether you are drinking enough day to day is to check the colour of your wee. So ideally, if you're well hydrated, we've got nice, light, pale wee. So up the top end of that colour chart. If your wee is looking sort of honey, kind of orangey, browny in colour, we're probably not drinking enough. So we need to be increasing our intake based on that. So sipping water throughout the day is going to be the best way to hydrate. For those of you who are really particularly heavy sweaters, or there's evidence that you're a really salty sweater, so after you've been for a run, you've got kind of salt crust on your gear, it may be worth having an electrolyte drink as well to kind of help stimulate thirst, but also recover any of those electrolytes. But typically, most of us, water is your best choice. Also, things like milk and juice can be helpful throughout the day as well. For anyone who's taking a multivitamin or a Berocca, your wee will be bright yellow. That is 100% normal. That's just the B vitamins being excreted from your body. You can still tell the difference between a hydrated Berocca wee and a dehydrated Berocca wee. So keep an eye on that. In terms of race hydration strategies, it's really, really difficult to give generalized recommendations for hydration. It's a really, really tricky thing to do. Most of us will need more in hot or windy conditions. I'm tipping at the end of April, we're not going to have a particularly hot race day, but stranger things have happened. And if it's really windy, more of a possibility. You will lose more sweat and you will tend to be dehydrating quicker. So drinking to thirst, practicing how much your body tends to need, and starting early with your hydration will be of benefit. There are some ways that we can kind of very crudely estimate your hydration needs by, I guess, weighing yourself before you run and then after you run, and any loss in weight. So if your weight is down after your run, that is equivalent to how much fluid you will have lost in that run. So say you're down 500 grams after your long run, you're down 500 mils in hydration, and we need to replace 150% of that. If you come out at about the same, you're hydrating really well. So we do have room to be dehydrated, and we absolutely expect some level of dehydration or some level of fluid loss in our athletes. But if it's a really large percentage of your body weight that you're losing, you need to be drinking more. So ultimately, practice, practice, practice. And if it is something that you're struggling with or need some individual advice, we can do a much more individualized hydration plan with a sports dietitian to work out exactly what you need. But in terms of general advice, it's actually, yeah, like I said, quite tricky to give. Alrighty, caffeine. I briefly mentioned this when I was talking about gels. So lots and lots of endurance athletes are utilizing caffeine. So I did want to touch on it tonight because I'm assuming there are lots of you who have questions. There are pros and cons of using caffeine. So it is something that, some athletes swear by. There is a decent amount of evidence for performance benefit to using caffeine. There is also a lot of cons that come with it as well. So the benefits of caffeine in terms of our endurance athletes are decreased perception of effort. Things feel a bit easier. That's a massive win. Increased alertness and improved performance overall. However, caffeine can really impact our sleep, which as an athlete, that is it's absolute gold. And if we're impacting sleep and we're losing sleep because we're drinking too much caffeine or consuming too much caffeine, that can be really detrimental. And the benefits will, I guess, be outweighed by the side effects. Gastrointestinal upset. So a lot of athletes will find that utilizing caffeine, whether it be around exercise or during exercise, really upsets their gut. And we certainly don't want that mid-marathon. So thinking about how you tolerate caffeine and what form you tolerate caffeine in or don't tolerate it. The other big thing that we tend to see with endurance athletes and marathon athletes is because of the decreased perception of effort, people can really upset their pacing strategy. So going too hard too fast or going too hard at any point in their race and then blowing up. So we don't want to be doing that. It's certainly not something you want to do in your marathon that you've trained really hard for. So if you are using caffeine, again, make sure you've practiced with it and you're not going to throw anything new in the mix. Effects of caffeine are pretty quick. So generally within a few minutes of consumption of caffeine, you will start to notice some of the effects, whether they be positive or negative. And generally they peak in our bloodstream at about 60 minutes. So some athletes will use caffeinated gel at the start of their run, and then again about 45 minutes to an hour from the end, just for that last little push. But I certainly don't encourage the use of caffeine if you're not used to it, and particularly in any junior athletes, any pregnant athletes, anyone who's got any cardiac concerns at all, be really, really, really mindful of utilising caffeine. Now, that is the end of my slides, but I certainly want to throw things open to the Q&A. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen in a second so that I can see. And Ryan, I might get you to throw some questions at me if that's possible, please.
Of course it is. We have had the Q&A light up. So we will go from the top down, and I'll try and group together some if they are quite similar. Some have names attributed to them, some of them don't. First question is from Ian. How important is it to have something to eat before a training run? I get up and just have a drink of water and leave. If I'm doing a 30-kilometer plus run, I'll have something to eat, brackets toast. Is this okay? I've managed this quite well.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a question that I get a lot. It can be helpful. So, from the point of view of one, optimizing that training session. So, if we're out running 30 Ks, we may benefit from the fuel in that. So, just might get a better quality session cognitively and also from a training benefits point of view. But more from the point of if you're practicing eating before a long run, race day nutrition is a little bit easier. So again, it's individual. If it's worked for you well up until now, keep doing it. Don't rock the boat. Don't change things. But certainly, yeah, if you are wanting to experiment with it, there's no harm in it. And like I mentioned earlier, if you're kind of starting with something small and working your way up, that can be beneficial as well.
Thank you. We've had a couple of similar ones about long runs, but the first one is referring to juice, which you mentioned earlier. Is the type
Yeah.
of juice important? What nutritional elements are in this to help pre-race nutrition? And then a follow-up for longer runs. Does the 120 grams start after 90 minutes or only once you've hit 90 minutes?
Oh, great question. So, juice, I'm going to answer that first.
Yep, there's a two-parter there.
Yeah. So with the juice question, most juice is pretty similar. So from a nutrient, like a micronutrient point of view, so vitamins and minerals, all different fruits have different vitamin and mineral profiles. So in terms of performance, it doesn't really matter. But from a day-to-day point of view, if you're getting a variety, that's a good thing. Tolerance will be part of it. So some people don't tolerate different types of juices, others do, but taste preference. So yeah, performance-wise, doesn't really matter. Mix it up if you're using it for nutrition day to day, and just go with what works best for you. But they're not wildly different in terms of types. And then in terms of the above 90 minutes, so essentially, it's before that. So you'd be aiming for so if you know that you're going to be out there for about 90 minutes, you aim for the requirements of 90 minutes if you can. But like I said, it is still within that range from 30 to, my slide wasn't particularly clear, I realized when I was talking to it, from 30 grams up to 120. So you don't have to be, and that is from go, you aim for that bigger amount. I hope that makes sense. I hope that answers that question.
Yeah, it does. It does make sense. And I guess I'd add there, which you mentioned in the presentation, you can train that. There is you can try and shift that window of carbohydrate intake over time.
100%. Yeah.
Two more questions. A lot of questions about long runs. So,
Mm.
what are your thoughts on eating solid food during long runs instead of gels, and varying what time you're eating each type of fuel?
Yeah.
So I guess that's hinting at interchanging perhaps gels and solid foods. And yeah, your thoughts on solid foods during training runs?
100%. Yeah, absolutely. And I probably didn't sell this as much as I should have. Yeah, definitely. There's benefit to it. And certainly, again, it's a training kind of tolerance and an individual preference sort of thing. So some athletes, yeah, absolutely, having a banana during their run is really, helpful, or having a solid, like a confectionery type solid, or even some of the bar type solids, some bread. Lots of athletes get really creative, and yes, solids 100% are a good option, and alternating in between can be really beneficial. And not that we're talking about ultras today, but for those of you running kind of more the ultra distance as well, so beyond the marathon, having those solids in place can be really helpful. Some people just find that gels do not sit well with their gut. And so for having a gel for a whole gels only for a whole marathon, just they don't tolerate it, but putting some solids in the mix can. So yeah, absolutely experimenting with that. And particularly in your long runs where you might have more flexibility, where you can kind of leave something solid on a track or kind of come back to it. Yeah, for sure.
Perfect segue into a question from Alyssa, who says, I have a lot of trouble with race fuel. An entire serve is too much for my stomach. What I have been trialing is to take one energy chew, or 1/3 of a serve, every
Mhm,
2 kilometers from 9 kilometers onward. It
mhm.
does mean that I'm often taking them without water. I'm still practicing this. What are your thoughts on that strategy?
Yeah, really, really smart. Yeah, absolutely. So again, practicing, starting small, even though you're not taking them with water, that's okay. The water recommendation with a lot of products is mainly from a tolerance point of view. So if you throw in, a really concentrated source of carbohydrate without water, sometimes that can kind of cause a bit of a gurgly tummy or a bit of an upset tummy. But if you tolerate it without water, there's no dramas with that. So yeah, sounds like a really, really sensible strategy, and working your way up. Sounds perfect.
Um, Talking about water, there is a question here about salt tablets for longer runs. And the reason I talk about water there is obviously water dilutes salts.
Mm. Yes.
Um, and I'll ask a follow-up question out of my own interest,
Mhm.
um, which is avoiding cramps. So part A, salt tablets, and part
Yeah.
B, anything to avoid cramps.
Yeah, great questions. So, um, part A, salt tablets. So, the consensus around sodium intake during activity is out. We don't actually know. um, there are some rough guidelines, but it's actually, yeah, there's still not enough solid evidence to kind of suggest that you should be taking salt tablets. For people who are really heavy sweaters, so lose a lot of sweat and lose a lot of salt, um, taking salt tablets or an electrolyte drink, yes, maybe, but I can't give you exact numbers because they just don't exist. So it's a really tricky question to answer and a really valid question, but it's just, yeah, so tricky to answer because the science isn't there yet. And again, it's quite individual. Some athletes really benefit from it, and anecdotally, they're like, yeah, if I take salt tablets, I don't cramp. Others are like, no, they just make me feel sick. So again, individualize that. If you are a cramper, there are a couple of different reasons for cramps. One is fitness and training. So making sure your training programs are on point. The other is dehydration. So just generally not drinking enough. Another is not enough fuel. So if you're just generally not eating enough. So I guess from a nutrition point of view, the best way to avoid cramps is to make sure you're eating enough pre and during event. Make sure you're drinking. So are you drinking too much or not enough? And it can go both ways. And kind of, yeah, trying to work out what the cause of your cramps are. So playing around with those different things. But yeah, absolutely, it can just be a training thing or a weak muscle weakness thing. Posture thing, lots of a technique thing, it's really varied. Some athletes will benefit from pickle juice. So if you are someone who cramps, carrying the little shots of pickle juice may be helpful for you to have throughout the marathon. So they won't prevent a cramp, but they will stop it, or they can, in some athletes, stop it in its tracks. But doesn't mean, 2Ks down the track that you don't get another one. But yeah, certainly a little bit of evidence for that. But yeah, cramps are complicated, salt's complicated. Sorry, I wish I had the answers.
No, that's okay. A follow on though, because we've
Mm,
we've touched on hydration.
yes.
David asks, any advice regarding hydration? How often during a full marathon? Um, and again, I will add to that very briefly. Thoughts on consuming on course hydration,
Mm,
and if possible, having bottles out on course. If you're not breaking rules, I should stress there.
yes. 100%. So yes, absolutely, like bottles on course if it's not breaking rules. Carrying like hydration packs or vests, again, if it's not breaking rules, can be helpful just because you can individualize it. You can work out when you want those things. You don't have to rely on what's on course. For most athletes, aiming to utilize what's on course is helpful. The elites do have a special table, which always helps for them. But certainly if you are, if you're worried about your nutrition or the timing of the aid stations just doesn't quite work out for you, have a look at, potential options for dropping stuff at different locations, or having mates on the course can also be helpful too, to hand you a drink bottle if it's not breaking rules. Because, there are certainly rules that we need to follow in some instances. Again, it's individual. Most athletes will benefit from starting their hydration earlier in the piece rather than waiting until you are thirsty and really dehydrated later down the track. Two reasons for that. One is, if you're dehydrated, it's actually hard to eat and consume your carbohydrates as well, and it gets harder to drink the more dehydrated you are. So if you're starting early and just little sips throughout, it makes it a little bit easier. But again, just working with what works best for you and your body. Little sips frequently is typically better tolerated than big skulls. And again, practicing if you're going to use the on-course nutrition, drinking out of a cup while you're running at speed is helpful.
Pinch the lids for anyone who hasn't tried it. Pinch the
Yes.
lid, make a little funnel. We have two more training questions, and then they're kind of more general nutrition related. The first one is, should you do a hard training session on an empty stomach? And the hard training session somewhere around 9 to 12 kilometers.
Yeah, so this is an interesting area in terms of the research. So there is some evidence to suggest doing some of our training sessions underfueled or fasted can be helpful, as long as we are also doing some of our harder, higher intensity training sessions with fuel on board. So we kind of need to practice both scenarios to optimize it. So a lot of the research has come out of ACU and John Hawley's labs around what they call train low. Just doing your run without eating anything and then following a good recovery plan afterwards. Your session will be lower quality, but it can help you to adapt. So again, it's getting quite technical, but yes, there is some benefit to doing some of your sessions fasted, as long as you're doing some where you are well fueled.
For anyone who wants to dive into that a little more deeply as well, Professor Louise Burke has published extensively in that area about fueling and restricted fuels, and even restricting fuels through keto diets as well.
Louise is John's wife.
Perfect.
So
Perfect.
Louise has done a lot of the endurance. She's the queen of sports nutrition, and she is a Ballarat local. Shout out Louise, queen of sports nutrition in Australia, and looks after a lot of our marathoners and endurance runners and endurance athletes. So huge amounts of carbohydrate research has been done by Louise, but her and John at ACU do a lot of the train low stuff, which is awesome.
Great. Two more training questions, which I'll tie together a bit. One is in reference to carb loading, and is it okay to back your carb load off slightly the day prior to avoid the feeling of bloat? I know that's something common for me as well.
Yeah.
So if you're building up, say the event's on the Sunday and you're building up Thursday, Friday, eating a little less on Saturday. And the second part to that, Ian asks, he's a heavy sweater.
Mm-hmm.
What do you suggest pre-race to make sure that he's hydrated, but he's not going to the toilet too much early in the marathon? So I guess about the combined question would be, how do you get enough without having the side effects of feeling bloated and needing to go to the toilet too much?
Yeah, absolutely. So if that is you, like if you do really struggle with that feeling of being heavy and feeling quite bloated, absolutely fine to back off a little bit in your carb load beforehand. Or it might be that you do rely on those kind of liquid sources of carbohydrate, or your really, really light, low fiber options. So cutting your veggies right back, cutting your fruit right back. I know it doesn't sound like something a dietitian would typically recommend, but relying on some of those more processed foods can be helpful in terms of that feeling of fullness and bloatedness. But yeah, if that's, if you're feeling bloated and crappy, I guess the benefit of your carb load is going to be outweighed by that. So yeah, certainly, it's okay to back off. In terms of hydrating, if you're a heavy sweater and you're not wanting to go to the toilet too much pre-race, electrolytes would be my suggestion. So an electrolyte-based drink. It can be a carbohydrate one or just a plain electrolyte. Doesn't matter. But I would suggest that's probably your best option because you're more likely to retain that a little bit better, and it might reduce your tendency to urinate. You can also practice that too. So if you're drinking well consistently, like if you're drinking quite high amounts, your body will self-regulate that a little bit too, so that it's not, on race day you've drunk more, so you need to pee more. Again, it's just about practice.
We have 2 more questions, so we will pause the discussion here. Just mindful of time. We're nearly at the hour, and these are less related to race day nutrition and more general. And they're great questions. The first one is, do you have any nutritional help for sleep? This may be supplements or what to eat before sleep to help with recovery.
Great question. And I absolutely have not touched on general nutrition tonight because I tried to keep it contained. But certainly in terms of sleep, so the biggest things that we can do to help our sleep are to eat regularly throughout the day. Will help us to sleep better at night. Supplement-wise, again, it's an area of lots of interest, but the jury is still kind of out and the consensus is a little bit out. There has been some evidence around things like tart cherry juice. Some people find that magnesium is helpful for sleep as well, but certainly the evidence isn't particularly clear and not clear enough or strong enough for me to say, yep, definitely have these things before you sleep. So no magic fixes, unfortunately.
No, that's okay. I will add though, as a sports scientist and someone who has investigated sleep a bit,
Good.
The 2 best things you can do to increase sleep: 1, avoid caffeine after lunch, essentially.
Yeah.
And 2, avoiding blue light. So blue light has a direct effect of stimulating that sleep-wake cycle, particularly the wake cycle. And so avoiding blue light, which is mobile phones and TVs prior to bed, particularly in the hour before you sleep, will greatly increase your sleep quality, or sleep hygiene, the field is called. Last question, which is very interesting to a lot of athletes that I work with, and it is, do you have any recommendations for nutrition that may help reduce inflammation or have properties that can help with this, food or supplements? Working with athletes that do a lot of high running volume, inflammation's a real chronic problem. Do you have any tips for reducing that?
Yeah, good question. So not necessarily, it sort of depends on what kind of inflammation we're talking. So if we're talking kind of joint inflammation specifically, again, it's a really, really broad area that there's still not a lot of answers to. Varied diet, so lots of different kinds of fruits and veggies can have anti-inflammatory properties, but the evidence around supplements and things isn't particularly clear. Omega-3 is a big area of interest, but again, benefits more likely to be from whole food versions rather than supplements. So fish, getting some more fish, nuts and seeds in our diet, some of those healthy fats, avocados, things like that can be helpful if we're talking joint health specifically and joint inflammation. But generally speaking, just a really good balanced diet, as boring as it is the best thing that we can do from an inflammatory point of view. Even when we're looking at inflammatory conditions, again, things like arthritis, there's not a huge amount of dietary supplement evidence. Yeah.
I will also very quickly add there, and Michelle hinted at this, it depends on the type of inflammation.
Yeah.
Please don't overuse or overprescribe anti-inflammatory drugs, NSAIDs, so ibuprofen, Voltaren. They are both not good for your gut, but they limit your adaptation. So there's a wealth of evidence now that stress drives adaptation, and one of those key markers of stress is inflammation. And so if we reduce those inflammatory processes through drugs, then you will reduce your adaptations to that. There's many studies on that. Now, I'm not suggesting don't take anti-inflammatories if you've been told to, or if you have an injury, that's a separate thing. But from the purpose of recovering for a session more quickly, you're probably putting the handbrake on by limiting your adaptations there. That is it for the questions. We've got a number of thank yous coming through. And I want to say thank you, Azal. That was incredibly informative for all of us. If you have any more questions for Michelle or would like to book a time to talk to Michelle, you can contact her at RAD Centre, RAD Centre, to gain some more detailed and personalised dietary nutrition advice. Thank you very much, Michelle. Is there anywhere else people can go to reach out to you or see your work?
No, absolutely. Jump on the RAD Centre website is the best way to get in touch. Shoot us an email, give us a call. You can book online if you want an appointment. That's the best way to get in touch. And more than happy to support any athletes, particularly local athletes, and answer any questions that you guys might have.
Thank
you so
you
much,
very
Vinny.
much.